Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. This is Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p, low detail on a ridiculously out-of-date graphics card, a GTX 970 4GB card, or maybe a 3.5 gigabyte card depending upon your point of view. Now this is being recorded on an external hardware capture card, not NVIDIA Shadowplay, so no performance is being lost due to the capture itself. The test machine doesn't even know it's being captured. We do, however, have a ridiculously overpowered CPU here, an i9-10900K at 5 GHz, which this is perhaps one of the most absurd pairings you can imagine, but it is my standard graphics card test bench, so at least it completely removes the CPU as being a performance limiting factor. In this particular case, we are looking at about 25 to 30 frames per second, at least in this point in the game. And if you look at the upper left-hand corner at the MSI Afterburner numbers, you'll notice that we went from one white number to 3. That's because it was at that moment that I pressed the F9 key, which actually engaged the benchmark itself. For those of you who have not watched our previous videos, the leftmost white number at the top left corner of the screen is the real-time frame rate. It's updated 1 time per second, and that is the current real-time frame rate that we're getting at this point in the game. The middle white number is the rolling average. It updates quickly at the beginning and then updates more slowly the longer you play because it is a rolling average across the entire benchmark. In a minute, it can vary by quite a bit. Over the course of 10 minutes of gameplay, it's eventually going to sort of settle down to where it's going to be for quite a while unless you do something very dramatic. And then finally, the rightmost white number is the rolling 1% low. Dropping the 1% lowest frames, it basically tells you this is the minimum frame rate you'll get 99% of the time, leaving out the sort of dips that occur from any open world sort of game. Now, I've done a full review on Cyberpunk, linked in the video description below. That is a spoiler-free review. There is coming very soon a spoiler version of the review covering the ending, covering the side missions, covering basically the entire story. So I've got 2 different reviews that you can watch depending upon whether or not you want to be spoiled or not. I want to talk for a few minutes about Cyberpunk's performance in general. Now, I have talked about this during our live streams multiple times. I have tweeted about this game. I've posted it on the Tech Deals Discord. Both the tweetbook and Discord are linked down in the video description below. But essentially what I've said is this is a game that really drove a lot of graphics cards upgrades. I had a RTX 2070 Super in my personal gaming PC at home, and I was happy with it. I was playing at 1440p ultra wide. I was playing Division 2. I was playing Ghost Recon Breakpoint. I was playing XCOM 2 Cities Skylines. My RTX 2070 Super was awesome. I had no complaints. In Ghost Recon Breakpoint, I did have to turn down the render resolution to 80%. At 3440 by 1440p, an RTX 2070 Super is completely playable at 100% render resolution, but it does have a lot of dips and stutters. The game is much, much smoother at 80%, but you really don't notice it. In combat, running around, explosions, you're doing stuff, you forget that you're at 80% render resolution. If you pixel hunt and freeze the game, speaking of freezing the game, don't laugh, that actually did happen. If you freeze the game and look at pixels, you can find the flaws, but when you're actually just playing the game, you really honestly don't notice. When I installed Cyberpunk 2077, yeah, it was playable. It certainly was playable. Set the details to medium, turned ray tracing down to medium, turned DLSS to performance. It's functional and playable. 60 frames per second, it was not. 30 frames per second? Yeah, occasionally, depending upon where you're at and what you're doing. It could be, at times, fairly brutal. So I decided to replace my RTX 2070 Super with an RTX 3070. Now, these are currently hard to find in the spring of 2021, but this was a number of months ago. I replaced it with a RTX 3070 and thought, great, awesome. I'm at 1440p. The 70 series is the card to go to. We are, after all, playing on a GTX 970. No problem. I'll just crank that detail up, and we will have... Oh, no. Okay, here's the deal. 40 to 50 frames per second average, not 1% low, average, at medium detail with ray tracing at medium and DLSS in performance mode on an RTX 3070 at 1440p ultra wide. Now, please understand this is ultra wide, which is 1.4 million pixels more than standard 1440p. So before all of you go scream at me and say, I have 1440p and my 3070 is better than that, yes, a 3070 will do 60 frames per second average at standard 1440p. That's a very important distinction that I think gets glossed over and overlooked way too much in reviews. In fact, my goal for 2021 is to start doing ultra wide benchmarks as part of our standard test bench suite, but that's a topic for another time. In any case, coming back to this video, at 1440p, to be able to turn all the pretties on, I ultimately upgraded from a 3070 to a 3090. Yeah, ouch, that was expensive. Now, I did it in February, so it wasn't too bad. The prices hadn't gone up completely crazy yet. And a 3090 will run at Ray Tracing Ultra, Detail Ultra, DLSS Quality at a higher frame rate than a 3070 will do medium detail, medium ray tracing, and DLSS performance. There really is that much difference between a 3070 and a 3090. It is massive. And you use about 12 gigabytes of VRAM at those settings on the 3090. So even a 3080 would actually be VRAM shorted. Wouldn't necessarily hurt performance too much. The card handles RAM compression pretty well. The game handles it pretty well. It doesn't really hurt performance, but the game will use over 10 gigabytes of VRAM. So if you want to future-proof yourself, there you go. But that's not here. This is a GTX 970. You can see we're using 3.5 gigabytes of VRAM, which is really the full performance RAM. Okay, let's not get into the 970 and the 3.5 versus 4. For those of you interested, Google it. It's interesting. It was the subject of a class action lawsuit and a big, huge mess. Performance is not great, but it is playable. Part of the reason it's playable is because we have an i9-10900K, which is helping. You don't need an i9 here. An i5 or an i7 or a Ryzen 5 or a Ryzen 7 would be fine. The frame rate is so low and the GPU is such a bottleneck, you don't need quite so many cores. But if you had an older chip, if you had a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old CPU, that would be hurting because of instructions per clock cycle. But in this case, anything reasonably modern, 6 to 8 cores at this frame rate on this graphics card would be fine. And given the current unavailability of graphics cards in 2021, maybe some of you have to. I was pleasantly surprised by how well this played. I honestly was. So if you're curious, will Cyberpunk 2077 run at 1080p at, well, playable settings, if not 60 frames per second, on a GTX 970 that released 7 years ago? Yes, it will. Thank you all so much for watching this short, sweet, and hopefully to the point video. Like, comment, subscribe, click all the buttons, do all the things you know what to do. Leave me your feedback. Would you like to see one of these per week? Just a straight gameplay with the benchmarks on the screen and my voiceover commentary. I know I've done some videos lately with benchmarks that didn't have voiceover. I won't be making any more of those. Let me know what you think of this down below. I can do one of these fairly easily each week if you'd like to see something interesting. Thanks so much, and I'll see all of you next time.